Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Libra Lopez, and today we're going to have a look at my top 10 books on language and what I actually learned from them. So this is not a summary of each book. You can do that easily on Google, but rather what I took away from them and what aspects allow me to understand the nature of language better. And number one is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus ex aequo with the Philosophical Investigations, the two main books by British Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, the Tractatus is part of the linguistic turn, according to which philosophy is fundamentally a conceptual discipline. It is about solving conceptual confusions, analyzing how concepts are used in everyday life, media, etc., and dissolving philosophical problems rather than solving them. Meaning, once we understand the conceptual confusion on which those philosophical problems are predicated, they just dissolve. They cease to exist because they were only based on confusion and misunderstanding to begin with. And the Tractatus contains very relevant insights on the nature of meaning. It basically claims that most of the questions that we ask, be it philosophically or otherwise, are meaningless. They do not lead to interesting answers or to progress of any sort because they cannot be answered in their own terms. And this is very, very important when it comes to polyglossia and linguistics, because many of the questions that we ask are meaningless. For instance, how many languages do you speak? Well, you're already presupposing that languages can be counted and collected. But is that true? Let us first discuss this. And if we cannot ascertain the supposed truth of that claim, then the question itself is pointless. Of course, the Tractatus also contains the famous quote, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." This, however, does not mean, as most people think nowadays, that the more languages we learn, the broader our world is. I have discussed this in depth in the video whose link you can see on top of the screen. And the second book is, of course, the Philosophical Investigations, which was compiled posthumously on the basis of notes from Wittgenstein. And it adopts a much more pragmatic approach. And here the key insights to me are that language is not a biological entity, but rather a socio-cultural construct. Second, that speaking a language means to participate from a form of life, which is why Wittgenstein famously stated that if a lion could speak, we wouldn't be able to understand that lion, because for that to be the case, we will need to participate from the lion's form of life. And finally, the idea of language games, of ways of talking, of patterns of intention when we use language. And the idea here is that many of the misunderstandings and confusions that arise in everyday communication come from mixing up one way of talking with another, mixing up a language game with a different one. And so as long as we sort out the language games in which we're participating, we should be able to communicate more effectively. Now, the second book is going to be the Genealogy of Morality. This is a fascinating volume written by Friedrich Nietzsche towards the late stage of his work. And here, the main idea is very clear. Life is chaos and tragedy. It is inherently meaningless, and we cannot grasp things in themselves, but rather only as we make sense of them through thoughts and language. It follows that there are many categories in language that we use in our everyday language, but which do not correspond to the nature of things. So they're not solutions for us to getting to know things in themselves, but rather symptoms of our hyper-rational weakness and inability to access things as they are. As a result, we use many manifestations of being, such as unity, causality, substance, etc., that are grammatical fictions. And these grammatical fictions cloud our judgment when it comes to making sense of reality, forcing us to believe things that are false. In the end, there is no such thing as being, there is only doing. And this leads Nietzsche to two key insights. The first one is that we will not get rid of God, we will not get rid of the transcendental until we stop believing in grammar, until we disabuse ourselves from those categories of substance, unity, cause, effect, etc., which are not how reality operates, but rather how we try to make sense of it with our human limitations. And then there is a related insight in a different work, which is the idea that concepts are metaphors whose origins we have forgotten. Concepts are reified versions of something much more lively and dynamic, which are metaphors. And so concepts such as democracy, terrorism, constitution that we use in our everyday life and in media are actually much more fluid than we would like to believe. And it is not until we dig deep into the historical underpinnings and genealogy of each of these concepts that we're able to see in what sense are they used in today's world. So that was very helpful for me to investigate the notions of terrorism, democracy, and constitution when it comes to contemporary Spain during my PhD. The third volume is Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. This is a very abstruse and intricate work, but the main takeaway is as follows. There is variation at the beginning, and on this variation, there is a subsequent power takeover whose nature is fundamentally political. So notions that we take for granted in the polyglot community, such as native speaker, such as mother tongue, grammar, etc., are actually the result of that power takeover. So that it is only when we analyze the political evolution that gave way to these notions and their successful implementation in society that we realize the extent to which we should not take them for granted or assume them as correct, but rather as symptoms of a certain political evolution that we should not necessarily take at face value. So in the beginning, there is all these desire machines and war machine, multitude and conscious, becoming a little bit like what Nietzsche was saying. There is no being, there is only becoming. And then there is a political takeover that results in all of these categories that you can see on the screen, in mother tongue, in native speaker, etc. So much so that according to Deleuze and Guattari, grammar is fascist. Because fascism is to political power what syntax is to language. It is a complete integration of linguistic structures into a rigid order, the same way that fascism is the complete integration of the masses within the state, as per Mussolini's definition. So again, just as Nietzsche said that we need to stop believing in grammar, Deleuze and Guattari are going to say that grammar and its unity are fundamentally political. So we ought to treat grammar as a symptom of a political power takeover rather than at face value. Then there is Rossi Braidotti's Nomadic Subjects. And this book led me to understanding that the polyglot is not just somebody who speaks many languages, as in the trivial understanding that we have of this figure, but rather it is the archetype, the paradigm of critical nomadic consciousness. Or as Braidotti put it, I just see myself as structurally displaced in between different languages, a state I experience intimately as my own way of being. The polyglot surveys this situation with the greatest critical distance. A person who is in transit between the languages, neither here nor there, is capable of some healthy skepticism about steady identities and mother tongues. In this respect, the polyglot is a variation on the theme of critical nomadic consciousness. Being in between languages constitutes a vantage point in deconstructing identity. So then again, very much in line with Deleuze, Nomadism as a metaphor for exploration and experimentation. As you can see, all these books share some family resemblance in the words of Wittgenstein. All these books have certain topics and tropes in common, but they articulate them in different ways that are highly complementary to each other, in my opinion. Book number 5, in chronological order, Not Like a Native Speaker, on Languaging as a Postcolonial Experience. And this, again, touches upon crucial notions that I have already explained. For instance, languaging as opposed to language. Why? Because there is no such thing as being, only doing. There is languaging, there is what we do with language, and that's all that there is. Then we come up with abstractions and categories, our ways of verifying that activity, and we call that language. But strictly speaking, all there is in the world out there is languaging, is the things we do linguistically. So languaging is a post-colonial experience, is an experience that does not participate from colonial categories such as mother languages or native speaker or mother tongue, which are all a posteriori, ex post facto abstractions that are idealized and come after the fact, rather than existing in the world out there. Hence why the title is Not Like a Native Speaker. Now the so-called native speaker, called in critical linguistics L1 speaker, is no longer the ideal or the yardstick by which to measure our own competence in the language, but is rather an idealization, and we treat it as such, and we no longer wish to resemble that idealization. Now we embrace the way we speak as the same as the way we should speak. We're content with that. Not only is it good, it's actually preferable to the idea of imitating, aping some idealization we call native speaker. This work is mostly for an academic audience, so it has very abstruse conceptualizations. It includes notions such as coercive mimeticism or the xenophone, etc. So it's dense, but nonetheless fascinating. Number 6, propaganda. This book was written by philosopher of language Jason Stanley, and we may or may not agree with his definition of propaganda. But at any rate, it contains a concept that I think is key for us to understand how propaganda works nowadays in our world. And that is a not at issue content. I have explained this concept in detail in the video whose link you can see on top of the screen. But essentially, it comes down to the idea that there are certain concepts, particularly metaphors, that contain a subreptitious ideological content that is assumed rather than being argued for. So that if you reproduce that concept or that metaphor, you've already bought into the ideological content that is implicit in that. For instance, when it comes to Brexit, those who were in favor of Brexit conceptualized Brexit as a splitting of the bill, meaning the rational calculation of what Great Britain owed to Europe and vice versa, and just the sorting out of it. So that metaphor implied that there was no emotional connection between continental Europe and the UK and vice versa. Now, was that true? That is up for grabs. That is a matter of contention, of debate. But what the metaphor splitting the bill does is assuming that content as something that is given. And that dispenses whoever uses that metaphor from having to argue in favor of that ideological content, in favor of the idea that Brexit is just about a rational calculus rather than an emotional and historical process tying continental Europe with the UK. So that's oftentimes how propaganda works, via the use of not at issue contents. So next time we read the media, we need to think, what is the not at issue content in this metaphor, in this concept, and make it explicit so that we can think rationally, is this even true? And if it's not true, what are the implications? Next is Colonial and Decolonial Linguistics, Knowledges and Epistemes. This book is very recent, published by Oxford University Press. It is an edited volume rather than a monograph authored by just one person. So here the key insight is that, as I discussed in my article, Decolonizing Spanish, colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial are 3 different paradigms. So oftentimes people conflate post-colonial with decolonial. They think as long as not colonial, then we've already moved beyond it and it's necessarily emancipatory or liberating. And that is not necessarily the case. Why? Because there is such thing as coloniality. Coloniality means the reproduction of the cultural paradigm of colonialism after gaining independence from the metropole. For instance, the idea that after Latin American countries gain independence from Spain, centuries afterwards, some inhabitants from those countries still think of peninsular Spanish as a superior variety of Spanish vis-a-vis their own. That is coloniality. And coloniality is very much at stake in post-colonial linguistics. If we want to overcome that baggage of post-colonial linguistics vis-a-vis colonial linguistics, we need to move beyond that paradigm into decoloniality. And decoloniality means making the people that have emancipated themselves from the metropole their own mental point of origin, so that they no longer have this cultural dependence vis-a-vis the metropole, this complex of inferiority vis-a-vis it, but they're able to appreciate their language, their dialect, as something worthy of respect in and on itself, regardless of its relationship with the language of the colonizer. And that is decolonial linguistics, is the idea that we need to protect languages and their community of speakers, not only from the colonial language, but also from any neo-colonial attempts to make the language of the people who gain independence resemble more and more the colonial language. So, for instance, when it comes to Ladino and Chabacano, which are endangered language of the global Hispanophone, many authors contend from a neo-colonial perspective that these languages, Ladino and Chabacano, will only survive if they approximate themselves more and more to contemporary Spanish. But that will imply that these languages will ultimately be the same as modern contemporary Spanish, and therefore will disappear in the name of their own survival. That is an example of neo-colonial linguistic policy purported and implemented from the lenses of post-colonial linguistics. We need to move beyond that paradigm and understand that only the community of speakers of Ladino and Chabacano, respectively, can decide what the future of that language looks like. And the respect for the decision-making abilities and dignity of that community of speakers is what decolonial linguistics looks like. Next on is The Language Instinct, a classic written in 1994 by Steven Pinker. And here, my main takeaway from the book was the mentalese. So there is a polyglot myth that we think in languages. We think in Spanish, in German, in English, and that learning a new language only really takes place when we start thinking in that target language. For instance, if I'm learning German and I make enough effort, after a few years, I will be able to start thinking in German. And that will be an important milestone when it comes to my learning that language. However, this is a myth. Steven Pinker explains that we don't really think in named languages such as Spanish, Japanese, German, French, etc. But we think in what he calls mentalese, in the language of thought. That has to be more complex than named languages in certain respects and more simple in others. Next up is a fascinating book and very polemical one called The Language Hoax. And here its author, John McWhorter, argues against the idea that each language necessarily means a different worldview, which is what Lera Boroditsky and others had argued. So it's a common polyglot myth to think that anytime we learn a new language, we gain access to a different cognitive universe. Yes, there is an influence that goes from languages to the world, and this is the weak version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the language we speak affects the way we perceive the world. But that influence is not such that learning a new language is equivalent to accessing a different worldview. That influence is much more modest, and we cannot extrapolate what are nowadays modest findings in the lab concerning, for instance, colors, time, space, gender, etc., to a wild conclusion, i.e., the idea that speaking a language means accessing a completely different way of life. The languages we speak do have a limited influence in the way we think and we perceive the world, but that influence does not amount to a completely radically different worldview. Or, in his own words, we hit the snag when we try to go beyond the experiment and embrace the notion that it is telling us something about worldviews, being human, and the like. And this book had a major impact in my career because ultimately it led me to realize that we can appreciate language learning and languages in general without necessarily needing to exoticize, romanticize what learning those languages and what those languages themselves mean. Languages are still fascinating without us necessarily being able to inhabit 7,000 different cognitive universes, or without us necessarily having the ability of thinking in any given named language. We do not need to engage in any of that for us to be able to appreciate language learning. And last but not least, Revivalistics. Revivalistics is a book written by Gilles in 2020. And this book is fundamental because of the simple fact that 96% of the people in the world speak only 4% of the languages, which means that language revitalization is becoming increasingly urgent and important. And here, Zuckerman distinguishes between reclamation, reinvigoration, and revitalization. So reclamation is the resuscitation of a language that is no longer spoken. And for instance, that was the case with Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew was no longer spoken, and then it was resuscitated into modern Hebrew. Reinvigoration, which is the strengthening of a language that is endangered, but it still features a significant amount of speakers, for instance, Yiddish. And finally, revitalization, which is the strengthening of a language that is critically endangered and has very limited intergenerational transmission, such is the case with Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. Now, since the revitalization of Ladino or Judeo-Spanish is my field of specialization, the importance of this book cannot be underestimated. But I think the book at large speaks to what many people working on the reclamation, reinvigoration, and revitalization of any sort of language nowadays need to explore. So that's it. There you have it. The top 10 language-related books that had the most impact in my career. Did you read any of them? Which ones are you interested in reading the most after this video? Do you have any other recommendations on your own? Please let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.